When I bought my property on the outskirts of Maple Ridge, it wasn't the grand house or the wide open pastures that drew me in. It was the wetlands. A quiet, shimmering stretch of nature, dotted with reeds, cattails, and the soft hum of frogs that sang me to sleep every night. Those wetlands weren't just beautiful, they were essential. They absorbed storm runoff, filtered the groundwater, and provided a sanctuary for migrating birds that had used this area as a stopover for generations. I was a retired environmental engineer, so I knew the land's value far beyond its aesthetic appeal. It was a living, breathing ecosystem. My house sat on the only small patch of high ground, and for years, the wetlands kept everything balanced. Then, the HOA came along. They weren't supposed to have authority over my land. My property existed outside their boundary when the neighborhood was first developed. But a few years back, the HOA president, a woman named Karen Bickford, sharp bob haircut, sharper tongue, pushed through an expansion of the HOA's jurisdiction to include my stretch of land. I didn't realize what that meant until one morning, heavy machinery rolled down my private access road. At first, I thought it was county work. But when I went to ask the foreman what was happening, he waved me off, saying, "HOA orders. New access highway to connect Ridgeview to the interstate." I froze. A highway? Through the wetlands? That was environmental lunacy. I rushed to the HOA office that afternoon, mud still on my boots, demanding to see the permits. Karen sat there behind her desk like she owned the world. "We don't need your permission," she said coolly. "The highway will improve property values and provide easier access for residents." The county signed off. I asked her to show me the county's environmental impact report. She smirked, rifled through some papers, and handed me a flimsy printout of a generic drainage plan. It wasn't even for my area. It was copied from a different subdivision 20 miles away. I knew at that moment they were cutting corners, maybe even forging approvals. I went straight to the county office, but they told me they hadn't issued a highway permit, only a small access improvement for internal HOA roads. Somehow, the HOA had twisted that into authorization for a full-scale paved connector through ecologically sensitive ground. I filed an official complaint that same day, but government wheels turned slowly, and construction didn't wait. By the next week, bulldozers, the rain began as a whisper, soft and unassuming, tapping lightly on my windows as if to give a gentle warning before it unleashed its fury. Within an hour, that whisper became a roar, a relentless downpour that blurred the line between sky and earth. I stood at my kitchen window, coffee in hand, watching sheets of water cascade over the half-finished landscaping the HOA had promised would beautify the new connector road. The highway, freshly paved and gleaming just a week ago, already had shallow puddles gathering along its edges. I knew what was coming. Water has memory. It always seeks its old paths, and the wetland's natural waterways, buried under tons of asphalt and filled dirt, were aching to return to life. By noon, the ditches overflowed. The HOA's so-called drainage system was nothing more than a series of shallow trenches, barely a foot deep, leading nowhere. I'd told them this would happen. In the original layout, the wetlands acted like a sponge, absorbing stormwater, releasing it slowly, keeping everything balanced. But Karen and her contractors thought a couple of culverts could replace centuries of ecological engineering. I stepped out onto my porch with my raincoat zipped tight, watching as the first small stream formed, carving its way along the base of the highway embankment. The smell of wet earth mixed with oil and tar. It was the scent of arrogance meeting consequence. Down the slope, I saw a few of the newer homeowners struggling to clear debris from their driveways. Water was pooling faster than they could shovel it away. The HOA had bragged about storm-ready infrastructure in their flyers. Now, those same roads looked like shallow rivers, and the current was gaining strength. My neighbor, Daniel, a retired truck driver with more sense than most, waded through knee-high water to my porch, shouting over the thunder, "They said the pumps aren't working! Karen's calling the county for help!" I could barely hear him through the storm, but the message was clear. The HOA hadn't installed pumps. They'd claimed gravity would handle the runoff, a decision made to cut costs. Gravity, however, was now dragging the floodwaters straight into the neighborhood's heart. I told Daniel to get his generator ready and move his truck to high ground. Then I ran inside and grabbed my camera. If the county ever questioned what happened here, I'd have proof. Proof that I wasn't some bitter holdout, but a man who saw disaster coming a mile away. As dusk fell, the situation worsened. The rain hadn't let up once, and the new Maple Ridge connector was now a roaring stream. Asphalt, it turned out, made a poor riverbed. Sections of it began to buckle under the pressure as water seeped beneath the fill, eroding the compacted soil. From my window, I could see cracks spidering along the shoulder like veins. Cars that had been parked near the highway's edge were half submerged. By the second day after the flood, Maple Ridge was officially declared a disaster zone. The county emergency management teams moved in with rescue boats and heavy equipment, while National Guard trucks lined the entrance roads that were still passable. The once pristine subdivision looked like something out of a post-apocalyptic movie. Streets cracked open, lawns turned to swamps, and fences reduced to tangled heaps of wood and wire. My property, thanks to its slight elevation, had been spared the worst, but my heart sank as I saw the wetlands that had once sung with life now muddied and chaotic, choked with debris and shattered remnants of the highway. It was a strange kind of justice. The land had reclaimed its power, but at a terrible cost. As I walked through the muck with my camera, documenting everything for the record, I overheard residents murmuring in disbelief. "They said it was safe," one man whispered, clutching his soaked HOA newsletter. "Karen told us the drainage was certified." The word certified made me scoff. The only certification they'd had was a falsified document printed by the contractor's nephew, a civil engineer whose license had already been suspended. I discovered that months ago, but no one would listen. Now, surrounded by ruin, those same homeowners who'd mocked me were looking for someone to blame. And their eyes were slowly turning toward the HOA board. Karen, however, was doing her best to control the narrative. The morning after the flood, she organized an emergency town hall meeting under a large canopy the county had set up for displaced residents. Her voice crackled over a loudspeaker, still commanding despite the chaos. "We are working closely with the county and the state to assess damages," she announced, clutching a clipboard, as if it could anchor her authority. This was an unprecedented natural disaster. No one could have predicted the severity of this storm. I almost laughed out loud. No one could have predicted it. I had, in excruciating detail, for over a year. My emails, my environmental assessments, my warnings at every HOA meeting were all meticulously ignored. I stepped closer to the gathered crowd and raised my voice. "Karen, stop lying to them. I warned you about this. The wetlands were destroyed by your construction. This was preventable." Heads turned. Cameras, both news crews and cell phones, caught the moment. Karen's face tightened, but she kept her smile plastic and cold. "Mr. Landon," she said with exaggerated patience, "this isn't the time for finger-pointing. We all need to work together." "No," I interrupted. "This is exactly the time. You pushed through an illegal expansion of HOA boundary." In the days that followed, the once proud Maple Ridge community transformed into a battlefield of accusations, insurance claims, and investigations. The HOA office, which used to smell faintly of lemon polish and self-importance, now reeked of mold and despair. Files were stacked haphazardly on tables, soggy from floodwater that had crept through the foundation. Karen tried to keep up appearances, strutting around in a borrowed raincoat and barking orders to anyone who would listen. But the illusion of control had long shattered. The county had seized her records pending investigation, and residents were lining up outside her temporary trailer, demanding accountability. "You told us everything was approved!" shouted a man whose basement had collapsed. "You said the wetlands were useless!" cried a woman clutching a photograph of her ruined home. Karen's face hardened as she insisted they were all victims of a freak weather event, but no one was buying that anymore. The media had already labeled her the HOA president who paved over nature, and footage of the collapsed connector road had gone viral. I saw it all unfold on my small living room TV, the same one I'd had since my engineering days. Reporters stood knee-deep in mud, gesturing at the wreckage as they interviewed officials and residents. My name came up frequently, often prefaced with words like whistleblower and retired engineer. I didn't care for the attention. I hadn't done this for fame. I'd done it because the land mattered, because it always mattered, even when people treated it like dirt. A week later, the County Environmental Division formally invited me to assist as a consultant. They needed help assessing how to stabilize the area and prevent further ecological collapse. When I arrived at the site, the destruction looked even worse up close. The wetlands had become a sprawling mosaic of stagnant pools and raw earth. But there was life fighting its way back. Tadpoles in puddles, dragonflies hovering over murky water. reeds beginning to push through cracks in the asphalt fragments. "It's healing," I murmured to Martinez, the inspector who had taken my warnings seriously after it was too late. He nodded. "Nature's tougher than people think." But the damage is deep. Months passed, and Maple Ridge faded from headlines. Its once notorious disaster becoming just another cautionary tale buried beneath newer scandals and fresher catastrophes. But for those of us who lived through it, the memory of that flood and its lesson never disappeared. The wetlands, reborn from the ruins of human pride, were thriving again by autumn. What had once been a sterile stretch of concrete was now a living tapestry of cattails, willows, and glassy pools that shimmered like mirrors under the morning light. Birds had returned. Flocks of red-winged blackbirds, cranes, and even the herons that had vanished before the storm. Every sound that echoed across that water felt like an apology accepted. I spent my mornings walking the new trails the county had installed. Eco-friendly wooden boardwalks raised above the wetlands, built after consulting with environmental experts. This time, everything was done by the book. Martinez and I had worked closely on the restoration plan, and together we made sure that nature, not bureaucracy, was the one in charge. We even installed signs describing the wetland's importance, the flood's cause, and how greed had nearly destroyed it all. It wasn't about blame anymore. It was about remembrance. Karen's story, however, didn't fade as easily. Her trial became a spectacle that drew national attention for weeks. She arrived in court with her hair perfect, her pearl necklace gleaming like she still thought she could control the narrative. But under the weight of evidence, emails, falsified permits, and testimonies from contractors, her composure crumbled. The jury took less than a day to reach a verdict. Guilty on all counts. When the judge read her sentence, 5 years for fraud, with additional civil penalties for environmental damage, she stared straight ahead, lips pressed tight, as if refusing to acknowledge the world that had turned against her. I attended the trial only once, sitting quietly in the back. I didn't go for revenge. I went to seek closure, to confirm that accountability, however delayed, could still exist. When she was let out in cuffs, I felt neither triumph nor pity, only finality. The storm had washed away more than her road. It had stripped her of the illusion that control could ever outweigh consequence. The HOA itself dissolved soon after. The residents voted to disband it, too ashamed and too weary to rebuild under the same name. They reorganized as a simple neighborhood association, focused on cooperation instead of control. Many of them reached out to me afterward, asking for advice on how to live with the wetlands rather than against them. It was strange, being seen not as an enemy but as a guide. I helped them design rain gardens, native plant buffers, and runoff basins that mimicked the wetland's natural flow. Over time, fences disappeared, replaced by shared spaces and walking paths. The community was smaller, humbler, but wiser. Sometimes, I'd see children playing near the marsh edge, their laughter carrying over the water. They didn't know the history buried beneath their feet, the greed, the arrogance, the flood. But maybe that was for the best. Let them grow up with respect for the land, not fear of it. One crisp morning in late October, I stood on the observation deck the county had built overlooking the heart of the marsh. Fog rolled over the water like a ghost, curling around the reeds in soft gray ribbons. I thought about everything that had happened. How quickly pride can turn to ruin. How easily paper permits can destroy what nature spent centuries perfecting. The flood had taken lives, homes, and reputations, but it had also given something back. Humility. Humanity's reminder that the earth doesn't negotiate. It simply responds. Martinez joined me that morning, his coffee steaming in the cold air. "You know," he said quietly, "we've had fewer floods this season than any of the past 10 years. The wetlands are doing their job again." I nodded, smiling faintly. "They always were. We just stopped letting them." After he left, I stayed behind, watching a single leaf drift across the water's surface. The silence felt sacred. In that stillness, I could almost hear the echo of the storm. The wind, the rain, the thunderous collapse of the highway. And then the sound faded into peace. Sometimes I wondered if the land remembered too, or if it simply moved on, indifferent to the human drama it had witnessed. Either way, it endured. That was enough. Later that week, I received a letter from a university environmental studies department inviting me to give a talk about the Maple Ridge disaster. They wanted me to share my experience as both a resident and an engineer, to explain what happens when human development ignores natural boundaries. At first, I hesitated. Public speaking wasn't something I enjoyed. But then I realized that silence was what had allowed the HOA's arrogance to grow in the first place. So I accepted. When I stood before that lecture hall full of students, I told them everything. Not just about the flood, but about the small choices that led to it. The dismissed warnings, the falsified paperwork, the laughter at public meetings. I ended with a simple message. Nature doesn't destroy out of malice, it restores balance. When you disturb that balance, the correction is never gentle. The students listened in absolute silence. When the talk ended, they stood and applauded. I felt hope stir again. Hope that maybe the next generation wouldn't repeat the same mistakes. As the years passed, the wetlands continued to thrive, and so did I. I grew older, slower, but still found myself walking those same boardwalks every morning. Each season brought its own kind of beauty. Icy silence in winter, a green explosion in spring, golden tranquility in summer, and fiery sunsets in autumn. The scars of the flood were still there if you knew where to look. Twisted metal buried beneath mud, faint outlines of the old road visible from above. But those scars didn't ruin the landscape. They defined it, told its story, and in their own way, they made it stronger. One evening, years later, I found myself sitting on the porch as the sky turned violet, and the first stars began to appear. A soft breeze rippled through the reeds, and the chorus of frogs began again, just as it had before all the chaos. It felt like coming full circle. I thought about how fragile balance truly is, how one woman's ambition had nearly drowned an entire community, and how the land, in its quiet, unstoppable wisdom, had rewritten the ending. The highway that once cut through this place was gone, erased without ceremony, but the wetlands stood eternal, untamed and alive. I raised my glass of water to the horizon and whispered, "You won!" And in the rustle of cattails and the song of distant herons, I swear I heard the land whisper back, not in words, but in peace.